The wind howled across the vast, frozen plains of Mongolia. The land stretched endlessly, its rugged hills and deep valleys untouched by time. The bitter cold bit into the skin of a lone traveler making his way through the barren landscape. In this unforgiving world, where survival depended on strength, skill, and the loyalty of one's kin, a boy was born who would change history. His name was Temujin. This is the entire history of the Mongol Empire and its lasting impact on world history. It was 1162, and the Mongolian steppe was a land of constant war. Tribes clashed for resources, power, and revenge. It was a brutal life, where alliances were made and broken like the changing seasons. Among these warring clans, the Baran tribe, led by a warrior named Yasujii. Yasujii was strong and clever, a leader who knew how to navigate the treacherous politics of the steppe. But even the strongest could not escape fate. Temujin's birth was marked by an omen. He was born clutching a blood clot in his fist, a sign that he was destined for greatness, or great suffering. His father, Yasujii, saw the potential in his son. He dreamed that one day, Temujin would lead their people to glory. But fate was cruel. One day, as Yasujii rode across the plains, he encountered a group of Tatars, a rival Mongol tribe. Thinking they were allies, he accepted their invitation to a feast. But the food was poisoned. By the time Yasujii reached home, his strength had left him. He collapsed, his life fading. Before he could do anything for his son, he was gone. Temujin was only 9 years old when his world shattered. The Baran tribe, once loyal to his father, abandoned Temujin's family. His mother, Holon, was left alone with her children, forced to scavenge for food in the harsh wilderness. They lived on wild roots and small animals, their bodies weak, their spirits barely holding on. Temujin grew up learning one thing. To survive, he had to fight. At 16, Temujin took his first step toward reclaiming his father's honor. He married Borte, a girl from the Anjarat tribe, forming an alliance that would later shape his destiny. But happiness was short-lived. Not long after their marriage, a group of Merkits, a powerful enemy tribe, raided their camp and kidnapped Borte. Temujin was furious. He knew he couldn't face the Merkits alone. He needed allies. So he did something no Mongol warrior had done before. He sought the help of his father's old friend, Togrul, the Khan of the Kharate tribe, and his blood brother, Jamuka. Together, they launched a swift attack on the Merkits. It was a brutal battle, but Temujin's forces overwhelmed the enemy. Borte was rescued, but something had changed. Temujin had tasted victory, and in that moment, he knew his destiny was not just to survive, but to rule. His next challenge was the greatest yet, unifying the Mongol tribes. The Mongolian steppe was divided. The Taichidi, Naiman, Kharite, Tatars, and other clans fought constantly, each wanting dominance. Temujin had a vision. He would bring them all under one banner, but he would have to fight for it. He began gathering warriors. But unlike other Mongol leaders, who gave power only to noble families, Temujin promoted men based on loyalty and skill, not birth. He rewarded those who fought bravely, creating an army of soldiers who were fiercely devoted to him. The traditional Mongol elite saw this as a threat. His own blood brother, Jamuka, turned against him. The steppe was about to erupt into war. Would Temujin emerge victorious? Or would the powerful Mongol tribes crush his ambitions before they could take shape? The battle for Mongolia had begun. The Mongolian steppe was on the brink of war. The tribes that had ruled for centuries, each fighting for their own power, were about to face a man who would change their world forever. Temujin, the boy who had once been left for dead, was now a warrior with a vision. But before he could rise, he had to fight. It was 1186 when Temujin finally made his move. After years of building alliances and proving himself in battle, he was declared Khan by his followers. This was a bold claim. He was not yet the ruler of all Mongols, but he had begun the journey. He had no royal lineage, no grand heritage. What he had was strength, strategy, and the loyalty of his men. Not everyone accepted his rise. His former blood brother, Jamuka, saw him as a rival. Jamukha represented the traditional Mongol aristocracy, where power belonged only to noble families. Temujin, on the other hand, was building a new kind of rule, where warriors were rewarded for loyalty, not birth. The division between the two became a war. In 1187, the first great battle between Temujin and Jamukha took place. Temujin's forces were strong and disciplined, but Jamukha had the numbers. For 2 days, the battle raged across the steppe. Temujin's army fought bravely, but they were eventually overwhelmed. Jamukha showed no mercy. He captured 70 of Temujin's men and executed them in one of the most brutal acts in Mongol history, by boiling them alive. This was a warning to all who followed Temujin, but instead of breaking his spirit, it fueled his determination. He retreated, but he was far from defeated. He spent the next decade building his army, learning from his mistakes, and gaining new allies. By 1196, he had strengthened his forces and launched a new campaign against the Tatars, one of his father's old enemies. This time, he fought alongside the Jin Dynasty of China, who wanted the Tatars weakened. Temujin's army crushed the Tatars, showing no mercy. But he did something that set him apart. Instead of sharing the power with other Mongol tribes, he took full control. This was the beginning of something new. By 1201, the Mongol tribes had seen enough. The leaders of various clans, fearing Temujin's rise, gathered and declared Jamukha as Gur-Khan, meaning universal ruler. It was a desperate attempt to stop Temujin, but the steppe had changed. Many warriors now saw Temujin's leadership as the future. The two former brothers met on the battlefield once again in 1202. This time, Temujin crushed Jamukha's army. Jamukha fled, abandoned by his own men. The nobles who once supported him now saw that Temujin's way was the future. In 1204, only one major enemy remained, the Naiman tribe. They were powerful, wealthy, and ruled over the western Mongolian lands. If Temujin wanted to unite the Mongols, he had to defeat them. The battle was brutal. The Naiman fought fiercely, but Temujin's army was unstoppable. With superior tactics and discipline, he wiped out the Naiman leadership. The survivors had no choice but to join him or flee. Among them was a captured young man named Yelu Chukai, who would later serve as one of Temujin's greatest advisors. By 1206, there was no one left to challenge him. The Mongol tribes gathered at the Onan River, where Temujin was officially declared Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. Mongolia was no longer a land of divided tribes. It was now one nation under one leader. Genghis Khan had unified Mongolia, but this was only the beginning. He now looked beyond the steppe to the rest of the world. The year 1206 marked a turning point in world history. On the banks of the Onan River, where the Mongol tribes had gathered, Temujin stood before them. The years of war, betrayal, and hardship had led to this moment. He was no longer just Temujin. He was Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. The fractured Mongol tribes had been united into a single force, and under his leadership, they were about to unleash a storm unlike anything the world had ever seen. Genghis Khan wasted no time in shaping his new empire. The Mongols were fierce warriors, but they had been divided for centuries by infighting. Now, for the first time, they were bound together under a single leader with a vision greater than mere survival. He reorganized the military, implementing a strict chain of command and a system of promotion based on merit rather than noble birth. Each warrior was expected to obey without question, and punishments for disobedience were swift and brutal. This discipline, combined with their unmatched horseback skills and archery, made the Mongol army an unstoppable force. But uniting the Mongols was only the beginning. Genghis Khan had a vision that stretched beyond the steppes. His eyes turned toward the powerful kingdoms and empires that surrounded his people. The first target, the Western Xia dynasty of northern China. In 1207, Genghis Khan led his army against the Western Xia dynasty, a powerful kingdom that controlled a crucial trade route along the Silk Road. The Mongols were still relatively unknown to the great Chinese dynasties, but that would soon change. The Mongols moved swiftly, crossing the harsh desert terrain and attacking Xia border cities. Unlike traditional armies that relied on slow, heavy infantry, the Mongols moved with incredible speed, striking deep into enemy territory before the Xia could fully mobilize. Their strategy was simple yet effective: terrorize the enemy, destroy their resistance, and force submission. By 1209, the Western Xia were in a desperate position. Their cities were under siege, their armies unable to match the Mongols' speed and ferocity. They attempted to hold out, but by 1210, their ruler, Emperor Xiongzong, had no choice but to surrender. He agreed to pay tribute and recognize Mongol authority, avoiding complete destruction for now. With the Western Xia subdued, Genghis Khan turned his attention to a far greater prize: the Jin Dynasty. The Jin controlled a vast and wealthy empire in northern China, ruling over millions of people. They had long dominated the Mongol steppe, treating the nomadic tribes as little more than unruly barbarians. Now, the balance of power was about to shift. In 1211, Genghis Khan launched his invasion. He led an army of around 50,000 Mongol cavalry, supported by allied Turkic and Tangut forces. The Mongols were outnumbered, but they had two advantages: their superior tactics and the political instability of the Jin court. The Jin emperor had dismissed his most competent generals, and his armies were unprepared for the brutal efficiency of the Mongol assault. The Mongols advanced quickly, defeating Jin forces at the Battle of Yehuling in 1211. This battle was a turning point. Using deception and mobility, Genghis Khan lured the Jin army into a trap, surrounding and annihilating them. The road to the Jin capital, Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, was now open. From 1212 to 1214, the Mongols ravaged northern China. They captured dozens of cities, slaughtering those who resisted and showing mercy to those who surrendered. The brutality of the Mongol invasion sent shockwaves through the empire. By 1214, the Jin emperor realized he could not win. He agreed to a peace settlement, offering massive amounts of gold, silver, and silk in exchange for Mongol withdrawal. But Genghis Khan never intended to leave for good. In 1215, after the Jin attempted to move their capital south, he returned and laid siege to Zhongdu. The city fell in the summer of that year, with thousands massacred in the aftermath. The Mongols had cemented their dominance over northern China, but their conquests were far from over. As the dust settled, Genghis Khan looked westward. The Islamic world, wealthy and powerful, lay within reach. His next campaign would take the Mongols farther than they had ever gone before. The fall of Zhongdu in 1215 was a turning point for the Mongol Empire. Genghis Khan had proven that his armies could bring the mighty dynasties of China to their knees. But conquest was not just about war. It was about power, wealth, and control over trade. The Mongols now dominated northern China, but Genghis Khan had his eyes set on something even greater: the rich trade routes of Central Asia and the vast Islamic world beyond. At the heart of this network was the Khwarezmian Empire, a sprawling domain that stretched from modern-day Iran to Central Asia. It was ruled by Shah Allah ad-Din Muhammad, a man who saw himself as a mighty sovereign but underestimated the power of the Mongols. What began as a diplomatic mission between the two empires would soon spiral into one of the most devastating wars in history. Genghis Khan was not just a conqueror, he was also a shrewd diplomat. Despite his reputation for destruction, he understood the importance of trade and alliances. By 1218, he had already secured control over much of the Silk Road, and the next logical step was to establish relations with the Khwarezmian Empire. To this end, he sent a caravan of 500 merchants to the city of Otrar, a major trade hub in Khwarezm. These merchants carried Mongol goods and an offer of friendship. Genghis Khan had no intention of war, at least not yet. But what happened next would change everything. The governor of Otrar, suspecting, or perhaps pretending to suspect, that the Mongol merchants were spies, had them arrested and executed. This was not a minor insult. It was an outright provocation. Furious, but still willing to negotiate, Genghis Khan sent 3 ambassadors directly to the Shah to demand justice. Instead of making amends, the Shah had one ambassador killed and the other two mutilated, sending them back to the Mongols as a sign of defiance. For Genghis Khan, this was unforgivable. The rules of diplomacy had been broken, and now there was only one response: total war. By 1219, Genghis Khan had gathered one of the most formidable armies in history. Some estimates suggest he led over 200,000 Mongol warriors, divided into highly disciplined units. Unlike the fragmented armies of the Shah, the Mongols fought as one, with strict organization and coordinated attacks. Their first target was Otrar, the very city where the Mongol merchants had been slaughtered. The siege lasted 5 months, but the Mongols' superior siege tactics and psychological warfare wore the defenders down. When the city finally fell in early 1220, the Mongols exacted brutal revenge. The governor who had ordered the merchants' deaths was captured and executed by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, a fitting punishment for his treachery. Meanwhile, the Mongols split into multiple forces to launch a coordinated assault on Khwarezm. In a series of lightning-fast campaigns, they besieged and destroyed key cities. Bokhara, February 1220, the city surrendered without much resistance. Genghis Khan entered the Grand Mosque and declared, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." The Mongols then ransacked the city. Samarkand, March 1220, the capital of Khwarezm, was heavily fortified, but after a short siege, it too fell. The city's defenders, including elite warriors known as the Turkic-Kinkalis, were massacred. Nishaper, April 1221, this city saw one of the most horrific massacres of the entire invasion. Legend has it that Toljin Khatan, Genghis Khan's daughter-in-law, ordered complete extermination after her husband was killed in battle. The Khwarezmian Shah, who had once boasted of his power, fled westward in panic. He abandoned his empire, leaving his people to their fate. He eventually found refuge on an island in the Caspian Sea, where he died of disease in early 1221, alone and disgraced. The Mongols pursue the Shah's son, 1221. With the Shah dead, his son, Jalal al-Din, attempted to rally the remaining forces of Khwarezm. Unlike his father, Jalal al-Din was a skilled warrior, and he put up a strong fight against the Mongols. In November 1221, he made his final stand at the Battle of the Indus River. Outnumbered but determined, he led a last-ditch effort to stop the Mongols from pushing into India. However, Genghis Khan personally led his army into battle and crushed the Khwarezmian forces. Jalal al-Din barely escaped with his life by jumping into the Indus River and swimming to safety. With that, the Mongol conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire was complete. The once mighty kingdom had been reduced to ruins, and its people were either killed, enslaved, or scattered. The Mongol invasion of Khwarezm was one of the most destructive campaigns in history. Entire cities were burned to the ground, their populations exterminated. Some historians estimate that millions of people died as a result of the war. The devastation was so severe that many of these cities never fully recovered. But for Genghis Khan, this was just another step in his grand vision. His empire was growing larger by the year, and he was not finished yet. His next move would take him farther than ever before, into the lands of Russia and Europe. The Khwarezmian Empire had been wiped off the map. Cities lay in ruins, their populations slaughtered or enslaved. But Genghis Khan did not stop to celebrate his victories. His empire was expanding at an unprecedented rate, and new lands lay ahead. To the west, beyond the vast steppes of Central Asia, lay the fractured Russian principalities and the kingdoms of Eastern Europe. These lands were rich in resources, trade, and manpower, but more importantly, they were unprepared for what was coming. In 1223, before the conquest of Khwarezm was even complete, Genghis Khan sent a small reconnaissance force westward to test the strength of the rulers of the steppe. This force was led by two of his most trusted generals. Subutai, the brilliant strategist whose cunning would shape the Mongols' European campaigns. Jib, known as the Arrow, one of Genghis Khan's deadliest commanders. Together, They led a force of around 20,000 Mongols, a relatively small army compared to the full might of the Mongol war machine. Their mission was simple: scout the lands, test the defenses of the Russian princes, and determine whether the West was worth invading. The Mongols swept through the Caucasus, defeating the Alans and Cuman tribes with ease. However, the Cumans, realizing they were no match for the Mongols alone, sought help from the Kievan Rus, a collection of independent principalities led by Prince Mstislav of Kiev. Under Mstislav's leadership, a coalition of Rus princes and Cumans assembled an army of 50,000 soldiers, more than double the size of the Mongol force. Confident in their numbers, they pursued the Mongols across the steppe, but they had made a fatal mistake. The Mongols, experts in psychological warfare, pretended to retreat for 9 days, drawing the overconfident Rus army deeper into unfamiliar terrain. Then, at the Kalkar River, they turned and struck with full force. The battle was a complete disaster for the Rus. The Mongols used their superior mobility and tactics to surround and annihilate the coalition forces. Mstislav and his army were massacred. The surviving Rus nobles, thinking surrender might spare them, were proven wrong. The Mongols executed them by crushing them alive under wooden planks. This was the first major encounter between the Mongols and the rulers of Eastern Europe, and it ended in catastrophe for the Rus. But surprisingly, the Mongols did not immediately press forward. After their victory, Subutai and Jib withdrew back to Mongolia. Genghis Khan was still busy consolidating power in the east, and it was not yet time for a full-scale invasion of Europe. In 1227, Genghis Khan died under mysterious circumstances. Some say from injuries sustained after falling off his horse, while others claim he was wounded in battle. Regardless, his passing did not mean the end of Mongol expansion. His successors, especially his son Ogedai Khan, were even more ambitious. By 1236, the Mongols had returned to Russia, this time in full force. Under the leadership of Batu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, and a legendary general Subutai, the Mongols were determined to conquer all of Kievan Rus and beyond. The Mongols had returned, and this time, they had no intention of merely testing the defenses of the Rus. Under the leadership of Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, and the brilliant strategist Subutai, they launched a full-scale invasion that would forever change the history of Eastern Europe. The Mongol winter invasion begins 1237 to 1238. Unlike the rulers of Europe, who preferred to fight during warmer seasons, the Mongols excelled in winter warfare. In December 1237, they launched their invasion of the Rus principalities during the harsh Russian winter. Frozen rivers became natural highways for Mongol cavalry, allowing them to move quickly across the landscape. Their first target was the city of Ryazan. Despite desperate attempts by the Rus to defend it, the Mongols overwhelmed the city after a 6-day siege. Once inside, they massacred the entire population, leaving no survivors. One by one, the Rus cities fell. Kolomna and Moscow were destroyed in early 1238. Vladimir, the capital of the Grand Principality, was reduced to ashes in February 1238. Tver, Torzhok, and countless smaller settlements were annihilated. The Grand Prince Yuri II of Vladimir attempted to gather an army to resist the Mongols, but before he could strike, the Mongols attacked first. At the Battle of the Sit River, March 4, 1238, Yuri's forces were crushed, and he was beheaded on the battlefield. With the northern principalities devastated, Batu Khan turned his attention to the south. But instead of marching straight to Kiev, he withdrew for the year, allowing the Mongols time to consolidate their power. In 1240, the Mongols resumed their campaign, this time targeting Kiev, the heart of the Rus civilization. Kiev had once been one of the most powerful cities in Eastern Europe, but by this time, it was weakened and divided. Batu Khan demanded the city surrender, but the Kievan prince refused. In December 1240, the Mongols laid siege to Kiev. The city's walls crumbled under relentless catapult fire, and when the Mongols broke through, they unleashed a wave of destruction. The population was slaughtered, with estimates of tens of thousands killed. Churches and palaces were burned to the ground. The once great city of Kiev was reduced to a smoldering ruin. By the end of 1240, Kievan Rus was no more. The Mongols now ruled over what would later be called the Golden Horde, a Mongol Khanate that would dominate Russia for over 2 centuries. With Russia under their control, the Mongols turned westward, setting their sights on Poland and Hungary. In early 1241, Bata Khan and Subutai led Mongol armies into Central Europe, launching simultaneous attacks on multiple fronts. In Poland, Mongol forces clashed with European knights at the Battle of Legnica, April 9, 1241. The Polish forces, led by Duke Henry II, fought bravely but were completely outmaneuvered. The Mongols decimated the European army, beheaded Henry, and paraded his severed head as a warning. In Hungary, King Bela IV assembled a massive army to confront the Mongols. However, at the Battle of Mohi, April 11, 1241, the Mongols crushed the Hungarian forces using superior tactics. Tens of thousands of Hungarian soldiers perished, and the kingdom was left in chaos. With Poland and Hungary in ruins, the Mongols had a clear path to Western Europe. Panic spread across Christendom. No European army had been able to stop them. But then, something unexpected happened. Just as the Mongols prepared to advance deeper into Western Europe, news arrived that Ogedai Khan, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire, had died in December 1241. Bata Khan, being a grandson of Genghis Khan, was a potential candidate for the throne. He and his generals decided to halt their European campaign and return to Mongolia for the succession process. The retreat saved Europe from a full Mongol conquest, but the damage had already been done. Entire cities had been wiped off the map, and Eastern Europe would take decades to recover. The Mongols had shattered the Rus principalities and left Eastern Europe in ruins. After the sudden retreat from Hungary in 1242, Bata Khan and his forces turned their attention back to consolidating their hold over the vast territory that would become known as the Golden Horde. This Mongol Khanate would dominate Russia for more than 2 centuries, reshaping its political and economic structures and leaving an enduring mark on its history. Bata Khan did not return to Mongolia to compete for the throne after Ogedai Khan's death. Instead, he established his own power base on the lower Volga River, where he founded a new capital, Sarai, in the early 1240s. From this strategic location, he ruled over what remained of Kievan Rus, demanding tribute and absolute submission from the fractured Russian principalities. Bata did not interfere much in the day-to-day governance of the lands he conquered, as long as the local rulers acknowledged Mongol supremacy and paid their heavy tribute. In the mid-1250s, Batu Khan died, and his younger brother, Berk Khan, took over as the ruler of the Golden Horde. Berk's reign was marked by a significant turning point in Mongol history. He was the first Mongol ruler to convert to Islam. This religious shift led to tensions between the Golden Horde and the Mongol rulers of Persia and Central Asia, many of whom still followed traditional Mongol shamanism or had adopted Buddhism. Berk also clashed with his cousin, Hulagu Khan, who had recently conquered Baghdad in 1258 and destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate. As a Muslim ruler, Berk was outraged at the slaughter of fellow Muslims and launched a military campaign against Hulagu's forces, marking the first instance of Mongol fighting Mongol. This internal Mongol conflict helped prevent the Golden Horde from expanding further south and west, instead solidifying its dominance over Russia. Despite internal struggles, the Mongol control over Russia remained firm. The Russian principalities were forced to accept Mongol overlordship, and every ruler had to receive permission from the Golden Horde before assuming power. The Grand Princes of Vladimir and later Moscow were among those who competed for Mongol favor, as being granted the title of Grand Prince meant having the Mongols' backing and collecting tribute from other Russian states on their behalf. During the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the Mongol presence in Russia was primarily economic and administrative rather than military. Russian princes traveled to Sarai to offer tribute, and Mongol tax collectors ensured that the empire's demands were met. However, the Mongols did not impose direct rule, allowing the Russian princes to govern their lands as long as they remained loyal and paid their dues. This period of Mongol dominance led to significant changes in Russian society, including a shift towards centralized rule, as the Mongols preferred dealing with one powerful ruler rather than many smaller princes. By the early 14th century, the Golden Horde had reached the peak of its power under Uzbek Khan, who ruled from 1313 to 1341. Like Berk before him, Uzbek was a devout Muslim and worked to further integrate Islam into the governance of the Golden Horde. Under his reign, Sarai became one of the most important cities in the Mongol world, bustling with trade and culture. The Golden Horde thrived economically, benefiting from its control of key trade routes that connected the Silk Road to Europe. However, despite its wealth, tensions began to rise between the Mongols and their Russian subjects. Throughout the 14th century, several Russian cities, including Moscow, began to grow in power. One of the most significant moments in the relationship between the Golden Horde and Russia came during the reign of Dmitry Donskoy, the Grand Prince of Moscow. In 1378, Dmitry led a successful rebellion against the Mongols, defeating a Mongol army at the Battle of the Voza River. This victory emboldened the Russians, but the real test came 2 years later. In 1380, the Mongols, led by Mamaei, a powerful but not entirely legitimate ruler of the Golden Horde, sought to crush Moscow's growing influence. Mamaei gathered a massive force and marched toward the Russians. Dmitry Donskoy met the Mongols at the Battle of Kulikovo, one of the most significant battles in Russian history. Against the odds, the Russians defeated the Mongols, marking the first major military victory over the Golden Horde. While the Mongols would later return and sack Moscow in 1382 under Toktamish, the psychological effect of the Russian victory at Kulikovo was profound. It was the first time the Russians had successfully challenged Mongol rule, planting the seeds of future resistance. The early 15th century saw internal strife within the Golden Horde. The once powerful Mongol state began to fragment due to internal power struggles, succession disputes, and external threats. The rise of Tamerlane, Timur, in Central Asia dealt another devastating blow to the Golden Horde. In 1395, Timur invaded, defeating Toktamish and destroying Sarai, leaving the once great Mongol capital in ruins. This marked the beginning of the decline of Mongol power over Russia. By the mid-15th century, the Golden Horde had splintered into several smaller khanates, including the Crimean Khanate, the Kazan Khanate, and the Astrakhan Khanate. These smaller Mongol states continued to exert influence over Russia, but they lacked the unity and strength of the old Golden Horde. Meanwhile, Moscow continued to grow stronger under the leadership of Ivan III, also known as Ivan the Great. In 1480, the final breaking point came. The Mongols, under Ahmed Khan, attempted to reassert their authority over Russia, but Ivan III refused to submit. The two armies met at the Ugra River, but instead of engaging in battle, the Mongols retreated. This event, known as the Great Stand on the Ugra River, marked the end of Mongol rule over Russia. The Russian people were finally free from the Mongol yoke, and Moscow emerged as the dominant power in the region, paving the way for the formation of the Tsardom of Russia. Though the Golden Horde officially collapsed in 1502, its impact on Russia was undeniable. The Mongol occupation had left a lasting imprint on Russian governance, military organization, and even culture. The centralization of power that began under Mongol rule would continue, influencing Russian rulers for centuries to come. The end of Mongol rule did not mean the complete disappearance of Mongol influence, as Mongol successor states like the Crimean Khanate continued to raid Russian lands for centuries. The legacy of the Mongols in Russia was complex. They brought destruction and hardship, but also new administrative practices and a more unified Russian identity. The centuries of Mongol domination had forced the Russians to adapt, resist, and ultimately emerge as a stronger state. The fall of the Golden Horde was not just the end of Mongol rule over Russia. It was the beginning of Russia's rise as a major power on the world stage. The Mongol Empire, once the most powerful force the world had ever seen, was no longer a single, unified entity by the early 16th century. The splintering had begun long ago, with different khanates emerging from what had once been Genghis Khan's vast domain. Yet, despite the fragmentation, the Mongols still influenced the world around them, particularly in Central Asia, Persia, India, and China. But time was against them. One by one, the remnants of the Mongol Empire faded, overthrown by new powers that had learned from and adapted to Mongol rule. By 1502, the Golden Horde, the once mighty Mongol state that had controlled Russia for over 2 centuries, ceased to exist. The Crimean Khanate, a successor state, dealt the final blow. Though Mongol successor states still existed in the region, the Golden Horde's fall marked the official end of Mongol rule in Eastern Europe. However, their influence lingered. Moscow had emerged stronger, adopting Mongol military strategies and governance methods. The Russian rulers had learned the importance of centralized power and absolute authority, traits that would shape Russia's development for centuries to come. Meanwhile, to the east, the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol-ruled empire in China, had long since fallen. Kublai Khan's descendants had ruled China for nearly a century, but by 1368, they had been overthrown by the Ming dynasty. The Mongols, pushed out of China, retreated north to the steppes, where they remained a powerful but fractured force. The Ming continued to battle Mongol tribes throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, fortifying the Great Wall to keep them at bay. But unlike in the past, the Mongols were no longer the unstoppable force they had once been. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate, another Mongol successor state, was in decline. The rise of new powers, particularly the Timurid Empire, had weakened the Mongol grip on the region. Timur, the great conqueror of the late 14th century, had claimed descent from the Mongols, but his empire was more Persian and Turkic in nature. The Chagatai Mongols, divided between their traditional nomadic ways and the settled cultures they had ruled over, struggled to maintain their identity. By the early 17th century, their influence had all but disappeared, replaced by new Turkic states. Further south, the Mongol legacy took a different form. In India, the Mongol Empire was rising. The Mongols were descendants of the Mongols through Timur and Genghis Khan's bloodline, and they carried with them many Mongol traditions. Babur, the founder of the Mongol Empire, was a direct descendant of both Timur and Genghis Khan. In 1526, he established Mongol rule in India, though by then, the empire had become Persianized. The Mongols brought a mix of Mongol military tactics, Persian administration, and Indian culture, creating one of the richest and most enduring empires in history. Though no longer purely Mongol, the spirit of Mongol conquest lived on in their campaigns. In Persia, the Ilkhanate, another Mongol state, had already collapsed in the 14th century, giving way to new Islamic dynasties. The Mongols who had ruled Persia had converted to Islam, blending their identity with the Persian and Turkic peoples they governed. The Safavid dynasty, which rose to power in 1501, owed much to Mongol administrative practices, though it saw itself as a distinct Persian empire. Though the Mongols had once been the rulers of the world, by the late 16th and early 17th centuries, they were no longer a dominant force. The Mongol homelands, once teeming with warriors who had brought Europe and Asia to its knees, were now divided among smaller khanates. These khanates, such as the Dzungar Khanate in Western Mongolia, remained powerful regional players but lacked the strength to launch the kinds of world-changing invasions their ancestors had. The Ming Dynasty in China continued to see the Mongols as a threat, occasionally launching military campaigns against them. The Mongols, in turn, raided Chinese settlements from time to time, but they were never able to reclaim their lost empire. By the early 1600s, even these Mongol remnants were struggling. The Qing Dynasty, which would soon take over China, would be the final power to challenge Mongol dominance in their own homeland. By the mid-1600s, the Mongols had largely disappeared as a major political force. The world had moved on, and the empires they had once ruled had evolved or been absorbed into new states. Yet, their influence remained deeply embedded in the regions they had once conquered. The Russians had learned from Mongol rule, shaping their own empire in ways that mimicked the Mongol model. The Mongols in India carried forward a mix of Mongol and Persian traditions. Even the Chinese had absorbed some aspects of Mongol governance during their rule. The Mongol era had officially come to an end, but their impact on world history was irreversible. Genghis Khan's empire had connected east and west in ways that had never been done before, creating a foundation for global trade, cultural exchange, and new political structures. Though they were gone, their legacy lived on in the empires and nations that had risen in their wake. The world had been changed forever by their conquests, and history would never forget the Mongols. The Mongol Empire, founded by Genghis Khan in the early 13th century, remains one of the most extraordinary forces in history. At its height, it was the largest contiguous empire ever, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. The Mongols shattered old empires, reshaped nations, and changed the course of history through warfare, trade, and cultural exchange. Their conquest destroyed powerful states like the Khwarezmian Empire, the Song Dynasty, and the Abbasid Caliphate. Yet, they also created stability across vast regions, allowing trade, communication, and technological exchange to flourish. Under Mongol rule, the Silk Road became safer and more active than ever before, linking Asia, the Middle East, and Europe in ways never seen before. This Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace, allowed goods, ideas, and even diseases like the Black Death to travel rapidly across the world. The Mongols were not just conquerors, they were administrators and innovators. They adopted the best practices of the civilizations they ruled, integrating Persian, Chinese, and Islamic governance methods into their empire. They promoted religious tolerance, allowing Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and other faiths to coexist. Their military strategies, including psychological warfare, siege tactics, and swift cavalry movements, remained influential for centuries. Even after the empire fragmented into successor states like the Golden Horde, Yuan Dynasty, Ilkhanate, and Chagatai Khanate, Mongol influence persisted. Russia, under the Mongol yoke for centuries, adopted centralized rule and taxation methods that shaped its rise as an empire. The Mongol Empire in India, founded by Babur, carried Mongol blood and military traditions into South Asia. In China, the Ming Dynasty, which overthrew the Mongols, still retained many of their administrative policies. By the 1600s, the Mongols had faded as a dominant power. The rise of new states, Russia, the Qing Dynasty in China, the Ottoman Empire, and the Safavids in Persia, marked the end of their era. But their legacy was far from forgotten. The Mongols had reshaped civilizations, leaving behind a world permanently altered by their rule. In the grand scope of history, the Mongols were more than just conquerors, they were world changers. They connected distant civilizations, advanced military and administrative systems, and left an imprint on cultures that endures to this day. Genghis Khan and his descendants may be long gone, but their influence remains embedded in the very fabric of global history.